If you've been with us, I should say we did have a bit of some technical difficulties. So normally we have a third screen here, which we don't have this evening. That's okay. Everything on the screen I'm actually going to say. So you just have to listen. And if you have really good eyes at the back, you will also be able to see the screen. But we've been considering the scriptures this summer. Shocker. Specifically because, as we mentioned in week one, feel free to grab a seat. As we mentioned in week one, we spend so much time reading these words, we thought it would be good use of our time this summer to just spend some time talking about the scriptures. And so, week one, we were presented with this, you can call it, definition of the Bible as a collection of writings that have been written and passed down through a divine-human partnership that present a story or an alternative story that lead us to Jesus. And so we've spent the first couple weeks specifically tackling the first half of that definition, speaking to the divine-human partnership that brought us the Bible, thinking about the authorship of who wrote it. We shift our attention this week to the second half of that definition that tells us that the Bible is something that presents, or it is a story or an alternative story that leads us to Jesus. Now, you see the word story in there. We're going to get to that in a moment, but I had you guys very briefly list a story that you are compelled by. I asked you to be brief so that I didn't have to be brief, because I have a story I want to share, and it's not going to be that brief as you were. Does the name William Tyndale ring a bell? Yeah? Some yeses, some nos. William Tyndale is a name I've known for a while because there's a seminary down the road, Tyndale Seminary. Although it's a story that I didn't know that well until recently, and it's one that is quite fascinating. Tyndale was a professor in England and a linguist, late 14th, early 1500s, and he lived in a time in England where the Bible was not readily accessible to people. And it wasn't readily accessible because, A, there just weren't that many copies of it. And so the few copies that there were in this location really were just housed in the church. Not even the priests really owned their own copies. And secondly, the copies that did exist were Latin copies. And so this is a time in English history where Latin at one point was the dominant language, but it had been phased out by Old English. And so most people just spoke English. Yet the copies of the Bible that existed were only in Latin. And so the only people who could really read them or understand them were really the elite of the elite and highly educated who could understand Latin. And so at this time, for a follower of Jesus, not only were there no copies for you to have at home, the only way for you to engage in the scriptures was to go to church. But when you went to church, the priest would read the scriptures to you in a language that you didn't understand. So the only way for a follower of Jesus to understand would be the priest interpreting the scriptures for you. And so, onto the scene steps William Tyndale, and he was one of these elite who not only knew Latin, but he actually knew the original languages that the Bible was written in, which is Greek and Hebrew. And so, upon reading the Bible in the original languages, he came to two conclusions. One, the Bible should function as the source of authority in a believer's life, not the priest interpreting the Bible for someone else. And secondly, he was strongly convicted that every single person should be able to access the Bible in their own native language. And so these two conclusions were not overly popular by the Church of England and the government at the time. They wanted the Bible to remain in Latin so that they could control how the scriptures were interpreted. Because if anyone could read it, they would lose that control. And so, again, these conclusions that Tyndale came to were not popular. So in order for him to do what he was compelled to do by the Spirit of God, he had to flee to Germany for a period of time where he spent time translating the Bible into English and then literally smuggled in thousands of Bibles into England. And I actually was in England recently, and upon being really recently just becoming aware of his story, not even trying to came across in the British Library a copy of one of the original Tyndale New Testaments. Now, it's a really not great photo, and it's really small because the Tyndale Bibles were like this big because they needed to be hidden from the authorities because they were illegal at the time. And so were these pocket editions of the New Testament that believers for the first time could have for themselves, but they would have to hide them in their pockets. Now, when King Henry VIII found out that this was going on, he did three things. One, he somehow got a hold and kind of purchased 6,000 copies and took those copies and burned them on the steps of St. Paul. Second, he declared these Bibles to be, as I said, illegal, and anyone who was found to be in possession of one of these books, not only would the book be destroyed, but the person who had the book would be killed. And thirdly, what he did was he sent a spy to befriend Tyndale, who fell for it. And so Tyndale was arrested for heresy for what he was doing, and he was deemed guilty of this heresy, so then spent some time in prison, but then was eventually strangled to death and burned at the stake because of what he had done. It's a crazy story. And it's both beautiful and tragic, but one of the coolest things that happened was it's well documented that the final words that Tyndale spoke before being strangled to death, he verbally prayed this prayer, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And it was a prayer that was answered less than roughly 3 years later, because the king had a change of heart, and he actually authorized the translation of the Latin Bible into English. And ironically, the people he appointed to do this translation used Tyndale's Bible as a primary source. And so this whole story kind of comes full circle. But as I've been presented with the story of Tyndale, I can't help but be presented with a lot of why questions, right? Why was there this guy that was so compelled to make the Bible accessible to people? And on the flip side, why were there the king and the church so compelled to make sure the Bible was not accessible to people? And this is just one example of times in the course of history, but also even just to this very day of people in positions of authority who try to censor the Bible as if it's some kind of threat, which I find interesting. And so the question stands, why is that the case? Clearly, there's something about this book that makes it unusual to every other book. And you see it in the testimony of a gentleman like Tyndale. You see it in the fact that the New York Times can't include this book on their list of bestsellers, because if they did, it would win every single year and would have won every single year that list has been published. And it's not even close, right? There's something that is unique about this book and its ability to influence us, to compel us, and to transform our lives. And so, again, why is that? And I believe it has something to do with both what it communicates, and not only what it communicates, but how it communicates what it communicates. And so this is where we're going to direct our attention for a few minutes this evening. And we'll begin with how the Bible communicates. This book is treated often in a variety of ways. To some, it is like a rule book for moral behavior. For some, it's we almost treat it like an encyclopedia for Christian thought. So if we're curious about what the Christian faith would say on a particular topic, you can turn to a part of it and find an answer to the question you're looking for. And there are appropriate times to treat the Bible in both of those ways, but first and foremost, the Bible is a story. Again, if you have great eyes, you will see. This is a breakdown of the type of literature that you're going to find in this collection of writing. 44% of the Bible is narrative or story. My eyes are now failing me. 33% is poetry, and 23% is what we call discourse or teaching. And so right away, you look at the numbers and you can tell the vast majority of the Bible, or the biggest type of literature, is narrative or story, right? It's David and Goliath, it's Moses parting the sea, all those kinds of stories. And this approach to communication through story, it's evident from the very opening pages of the Bible. I recently, is Beverly here this evening? No? I recently, Silas and I went to Beverly's apartment because she has all these books that she's wanting to give away. And so we went, and I walked into this rather small room with a ton of books. And I remember saying, Beverly, like, you read all of these books? And she's like, yeah. But like, with a lot of them, you only really need to read the first chapter and the last chapter, and then you kind of get the gist of the book. Now, most of them she has read cover to cover, but there were a few she said, you don't really need to read the whole thing. Not a reading technique I would endorse when it comes to the Bible, but if you were to do that with the Bible, if you were to only read the opening words and the closing words of the Bible, what would you read? Well, the opening chapter of the Bible tells us, or reads, in the beginning. And in the closing chapter of the Bible, you will read the words, and they reigned forever and ever. Rule books and encyclopedias do not begin this way. As Disney would tell us, this is how stories begin and end. And again, what exactly the story is that the Bible is communicating, we'll get to in a moment, but I just want us to stop and consider, because maybe we've never done this before. Stop and consider for a moment the fact that God's divinely inspired word for us is largely communicated through story. It's an interesting thought. There's a psychologist by the name of Jonathan Gottschall. He's best known for his book, The Storytelling Animal, a book about human beings being wired for story. And in the book, he writes this. If you can't read it, I will read it for us. Humans are storytelling animals. We thrill to an astonishing multitude of fiction on pages, on stages, and on screens. Murder stories, war stories, conspiracy stories, love stories, true stories, false stories. We are, as a species, addicted to story. But our addiction runs deeper than we think. We can walk away from our books and our screens, but we can never walk away from story. For humans, story is like a gravity, an inescapable field of force that influences everything, but is so omnipresent that we hardly even notice it. And he points out our story-oriented selves begins at a very early age. As children, what do we love to do as kids? To play make-believe. Make-believe? Make-believe? Yep. Which one is it? One of them, where we imagine these like fictitious stories that we're the central character in, and we have a ton of fun playing out these make-believe stories. And this isn't just something we notice as a kid. What is one of the biggest industries in our world today? It's the entertainment industry. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry who, through movies and TV shows and video games and books and commercials and songs, tell stories that we, A, pay a lot of money to engage in, and B, spend a lot of time engaging in and find a lot of pleasure doing so. And our story-oriented selves, he points out, doesn't even stop when we fall asleep. Because when we sleep, we dream. And what are our dreams? It's once again us living out these crazy stories that our mind is somehow coming up with as we are fast asleep. And Jonathan, he takes it a step further and says, it's not just that we're like entertained by stories, but stories actually like help us make sense of the world around us. I read a New York Times article written by him, and he says this. He says, remember in Star Wars, when Luke Skywalker precisely aims his proton torpedoes into the vent shaft of the Death Star. Do we have Star Wars fans here? We know what we're talking about. Maybe? Come on. Of course you do. It's memorable because it's the climax of a grand story about good triumphing over evil. More importantly, Luke's scene provides a good analogy. It's not easy to infect the brain of another person with an idea. It can be accomplished only by hitting a small exposed hole in the system. And for the human brain, that hole, as he would say, is story-shaped. Now, this is not a new observation, he says, but nowadays we have a better understanding as to why this is true. Changing the brain requires the correct neurotransmitters, and those are especially in attendance when a person is curious, when a person is predicting what will happen next, and is emotionally engaged. 3 things that happen when we are engaged in a really good story. This is why the Olympics are coming up soon. This is why, pay attention, when you're watching the Olympics, or if you're like an America's Got Talent fan, when the producers of those programs want you to cheer for a particular person, they often give you they'll share a little bit of a backstory to that person, right? What they've been through and how they've gotten to where they've gotten. This is why our teachers and preachers try to incorporate stories into teaching. And this is why Jonathan, who, from my understanding, is not actually a Christian, concludes successful religious texts are not written as nonfiction arguments or bulleted lists of claims. They are stories. And all of that is because stories have the ability to appeal to both our intellect and our emotion, or you could say both the left and the right side of our brains, and thus are highly effective at shaping the way that we think about others, about ourselves, and about our world. And again, the reason I had us consider stories that have been compelling to us in the past at the beginning is because all of us, at some point, whether we could think of it or not, have been presented with a story or read a story or witnessed a story unfold before us that has deeply impacted the way that we view the world and how we feel like we should live in it. And so if we consider again the Tyndale story, and specifically people in history and this very day who have sought to silence the Bible. The reason they do it is because there's something about this story that doesn't really work with their agenda. And so they feel the need to suppress this book because they know the power that it has to shape the way those under their authority view the world and how they should live in it. There's this saying I've come across that I really like that says, the story you live in is the story you live out. And so when there's someone that wants to control the story you live out, they need to control the story that you live in, which is why the Bible, time and time again by various people, has been considered almost a very big threat. Now, we live in the 21st century. We do not live in a time where there is a prohibition on the Bible. In fact, we live in a time that it's the exact opposite. The Bible has never been more accessible to humans than in our specific time and place. As Wes mentioned last week, there are countless really, really, really good English translations of the Bible that in 2 seconds, when I pull out my phone, I can access on my fingertips. And so we don't live in a time where we don't have access to this book. But that being said, the Bible is just one of, I would say, many stories that we are presented with in our kind of current cultural moment, right? There's a lot of other stories that we come across through engagement in movies and TVs and social media and things our coworkers tell us that, just like the Bible, speak to similar things, like who we are as humans and what our purpose is and what we should be living for and what's good and what's not good. Those stories just give different answers to those questions. And it's these other stories that I think our culture often wants us to live in and live out. And so in like a post-Christian world that we would live in, I would say the Bible's not just a story, it's like an alternative story. It's different from all the other stories that we're often bombarded with. And what the Bible does is call into question some of these other stories that we are presented with. Which gets us to the question, what does the Bible actually communicate? What is the story that it is telling us? Earlier I mentioned 44% of the Bible is narrative or story, and there's a lot of stories that go into that 44%, but they're not independent stories. They're rather stories that are trying to work together to tell a unified story. Familiar with Tim Keller? Tim says, we often get confused with the Bible because we usually read it as a series of disconnected stories with morals. It's not. It comprises a single story telling us how the human race got into its current condition. Right? He says, if you get lost in the smaller stories, you will miss the larger one. And so what is this larger story? If you've been around Northridge the last few years, you know the name Tim Mackie comes up quite a bit. And the reason we mention him is because, I think he's one of the sharper minds in the church in the West these days, but he has made it his life's mission to make sure people see how these individual stories connect together. Right? We often mention the Bible Project. Their slogan is the Bible is a unified story. And so he's made it his life purpose to make sure people know that. And so as we did a few weeks ago, I'm just going to play a clip of Tim in about 5 minutes walking through, how many pages does a typical Bible have? Roughly, my Bible has 1,300 pages of text in about 5 minutes. So we're going to listen in. And I'll continue afterwards. And again, you might not be able to see that well. That's okay. It's what he's saying that we need to listen for. So, should work.
Jesus, like all devout Jews of his time, believed that this collection of writings was telling a story. And what this collection is it's a... How you guys doing? Good. Okay, great. All right, good. I'm great. Yeah, totally. Me too. So what this collection is, it's a collection of ancient Israelite texts that we come around every single week. And they tell the story of Jesus' family. They're a family history. And they tell the story of Jesus' ancestors that begins specifically with a guy named Abraham that God called out of ancient Mesopotamia. And this family had a consistent story of encounters with this God over their history. The promise that this God made to their ancestor Abraham was that unending, rich, abundant, infinite life was a gift from God to our world. And he wanted to give that gift to all of creation through this particular family, which is quite a bold claim to believe about oneself, but that is the claim that this family makes about themselves in the story. And Jesus fully accepted that claim. What's interesting about the family story is after receiving this gift, the entire history of this family over every single generation, if you take the time to read it, is just a comedy of errors, to put it lightly. The family takes this promise and they abuse it, misuse it, misunderstand it, misapply it, become apathetic about it, or idolatrous about it in every way possible. And the whole story is really an expose on how short-sighted and stupid and selfish and bent toward violence that human beings are. And the family fails miserably at stewarding the gift that God gave them. However, there was a group of Israelites among this family who really believed that God was going to do something through them despite their failure. And so God hands them over to self-destruction, but promises that in their suffering that is self-caused, God will be with them, and he will never forsake them and never forsake his promise. And so the prophets began to foster this hope. Well, if God made this promise, and if we seem unable to keep it, then God's going to have to be the one to keep our end of the deal and his end of the deal. And so the prophets dreamed of a day when this family would be so immersed with the presence and the love of God that it's like their hearts and their minds are created all over again to become brand new kinds of humans. They dreamed of a day when their God would come to live personally among them and experience intimate union with them. The prophets talk in their poetry about a day when God would send a deliverer, like a royal priestly figure who would rescue them and rescue all of the nations out of the mess that we've made of God's good world. That figure's called the Messiah. And that's how the story of the Hebrew Bible ends. It's like an unfinished story. And that's the story that Jesus claimed that he was carrying to its next stage of fulfillment, which is why he said the things like I just read a little bit earlier. So, except Jesus' claim was even bolder and wider than that, because Jesus claimed not only to be the faithful Israelite who would finally be the faithful partner among this family that God could work with, he also claimed that he was Israel's God, become human, to be the covenant partner that God had called his people to be, but that they consistently failed to be. He actually was both ends of the deal, fulfilling the covenant partnership as an extraordinary act of love and generosity, which is just apparently who this God is. And so when Jesus enters into the human story, he enters into the suffering of hurting, poor people as a display of the love of God. And he also provoked the powers that be in his day to show just how corrupt and idolatrous their family had become. And in Jesus' life and in his death, he enters into the mess that we have made. He takes it into himself and he allows it to kill him, because only he has the power to bring life out of death and love out of hate. And in Jesus' resurrection from the dead, he is fulfilling the destiny that God has placed on the human family, but that we consistently come up short on our end of the deal. And it gets even better. It's a good story so far, yeah? Mm-hmm. It gets even better. Because after his resurrection, Jesus promised that he would actually share the life and the love that he had with God, his Father, and share it with all of us, his followers. And in Pentecost and sending out of the Spirit, he actually shares with us the love and the power that he spread in the world. And so here we all are 2,000 years later, turning to this same foundation story. But even more, he sent out his followers into the world and appointed a handful specifically to represent him and start new Jesus communities around the world. That's a group of people called the apostles. It's a Greek word spelled with English letters that means the ones who are sent. And so those apostles started Jesus communities all over the Roman Empire, and then they wrote letters to all of these churches, and that makes up the bulk of what we call the New Testament, alongside the written versions of the stories of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And so here we all are, descendants, as it were, of all of this great family history that comes to its fulfillment in the story of Jesus.
So that is the story of the Bible in 6 minutes. Right, it's a story primarily about God, but specifically about God and his encounter with a particular family that, as Tim says, finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus. Now, as I listened to that story kind of outlined in a concise way, and maybe as you have spent for many of you, lives engaged in this story, you come to realize that through this story, what the Bible is doing is raising and answering really big, almost like existential questions that as humans we're like hardwired almost to want to ask and find answers to, right? Questions like, who are we as humans? Where are we? Why are we here? What is the problem and what is the solution? And according to the Bible, if I were to answer these questions through the story that the Bible presents to us that we just heard, who are we? We are we are beings that are made in the image of God, though we have a serious heart problem. Where are we? We are in a world created and sustained by the one true living God, who is the source of all things good, noble, and true. What is our purpose? Why are we here? Well, we're here to A, receive the love of God, and B, glorify him by partnering with him to reflect that love back out into his created world. Now, what's the problem, right? What's the thing that prevents us from living out that calling that God has given to us? Us. We are the problem. It comes back to that heart issue or sinful nature that almost plagues us. And again, according to the story of the Bible, as you read through it, the solution, we can't solve this problem on our own, right? We need someone who is one with God to deal with the train wreck of humanity, right? To transform our hearts to live the kinds of life that we were created to live, both now and for eternity. And as the story of the Bible presents it to us, that person was Jesus. Now, I will say that the Bible's not unique in raising these kinds of questions, right? There's lots of stories, religious texts, but just also stories we encounter that raise similar kinds of questions. Anytime you watch a movie where someone's trying to find their calling in life and what it looks like to find that and live it out, they're asking similar kinds of questions. The Bible's just unique, again, in how it answers those questions. And so there are a lot of stories out there that we will encounter that provide very different answers than the answers I just went through. And I think if I were to reflect on at least my time as a follower of Jesus and what I have observed as common answers to these questions in our time and place, I think at one point, the popular answers to these questions, largely as a post-Darwin and natural selection, I think common answers were as humans were an accumulation of cells that are like any other creature in this world, and we're here by chance and natural selection, which means we don't really have that much of a purpose in life, and so the solution is to survive or seek some kind of gratification of some sort. Now, some people might feel like those are appropriate answers to those questions. I think that's probably a little bit fringe nowadays because no one wants to live in a world where that's true. And so what I have observed as maybe more common answers to these questions that you'll find in our particular culture would be more, who are we? We are beings not made in the image of God, but made in our own image, right? And each of us have our own unique identity and calling. Where are we? We're in a fluid or I use the word variable world where truth's a little bit subjective. And we were here by maybe some absentee, impersonal higher power that exists somewhere, but definitely not here. Why are we here? Well, we're here to discover and embrace and live out this unique identity and calling that each and every one of us have. Now, that's not always easy, right? There's usually problems that we come across in order to seek to discover, embrace, and live out our unique identity. And the problem is usually, oh no, there it is, other people, right? We're not the problem. Other people are the problem. They're the ones that get in the way of me living out my unique identity and calling. And so the solution would be to do, to the best of our ability, create a world that accommodates to more than one vision of human flourishing, with a caveat that as long as it doesn't contradict my personal vision for human flourishing. Now again, these are not the only answers to these questions. They're just ones that I have observed to be quite popular nowadays. And as you can see, they're undeniably different than the answers that the story of the Bible presents to us. And by my observation, there's there's three really big differences between, again, you could use the language of like cultural narratives that are used to kind of to come up with these answers, and the narrative of the Bible. First and foremost, the story of the Bible does not present God as an impersonal, absentee higher power, but one who is deeply personal and present. Right? As you read the Bible, God, time and time and time and time again, chooses to reveal himself, right? At points in the prophets, and then through his Son and through his Holy Spirit and through his word. He has done everything he can to reveal himself to us. He is not this absentee God. Secondly, I think a big difference is, again, the Bible is clear that our identity, right, who we are as like human beings personally, is something that is given to us, not something that we are trying to discover for ourselves, right? And that's because we are not the ultimate source of truth. God is the ultimate source of truth. And so that means the truest thing about myself is not what I discover about myself through like my passions or my abilities. Rather, what God, who is the ultimate source of truth, declares over my life. It's one of the wonderful things of Scripture. You can read it and see what God has declared over us, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made and deeply loved and never abandoned or forsaken. The list could go on. Now, these are definitely, again, differences you'll see in the culture narratives versus the biblical narratives. I think the one that I personally have noticed where these two things really butt heads, where the world will tell us that our calling or purpose in life is A, to be discovered, but B, unique to each person, like what we're put on this earth for. It's unique to all of us. I would argue the Bible tells us that our calling is, as I phrase it, uniquely ununique. And by uniquely ununique, I mean that God has created us as unique individuals with unique gifts and abilities and strengths and weaknesses that he wants us to take and to use, but he wants us to use them to contribute to a collective calling that's not just unique to me, but that encompasses all of us, right? It's a call to receive and reflect his love. It's a call to partner with him. It's a call to community, not individualism, a call to serve, not be served, a call to humility, not pride, a call, again, to live our lives for his name's sake, not our name's sake, right? These are collective callings that he has just placed on humanity. And in our uniqueness, he wants us to almost work together in that corporate, I think, calling. And I think if I were to say that, if our culture was a person and I were to tell that person that's what the Bible presents, I don't think our culture would like that, because I think there's this appeal to the fact that we're like unique, like that's something that our world generally likes. But if I reflect on my own experience, I think one of the things that I have appreciated most about the story that the Bible presents to us is the fact that my purpose in life is not unique to me. Like that's something I actually appreciate. Knowing that when I wake up every day that I'm actually a part of a community who is living their life for the same purpose that I am living my life for, and that I'm part of something that's greater than just me, and it's not something I have to figure out on my own, but it's something that's given to me by the God of this universe. And so I'd imagine many of you would have experienced a similar thing of the deep satisfaction of contributing to a purpose that is greater than our own. And that shouldn't come as a surprise, because that's literally the way that God created us to be. And so, again, different answers that this wonderful story presents, that stories we will find elsewhere might communicate differently. And so I want to turn it over to some questions on our table, but before I do, I'm just going to bring this full circle for a moment. Again, we started considering the story of Tyndale, and the fact that over the course of history, there have been those who have wanted to control the identity and calling of those under their influence. And because of that, they felt threatened by the Bible, because the Bible has something to say about our identity and calling and what exactly we were created for. And on the flip side, right, you can see that why those in history, like Tyndale, were willing to give up their life for the sake of this book, because they came to experience the truths that this book has for us, and their lives were radically transformed by them, right? I would say they came to experience the abundant life that Jesus has on offer for us through their engagement with this book, which is why they held it in such high regard. And I'll close with a quote from Tyler Staton, who says, "This is how the Bible and its story has brought down empires without firing a single shot." It is so unique in its ability to compel and convict and transform, because this is I would argue, one of, the primary ways God has chosen to reveal himself to us. And I think that's pretty cool that we can hold that in our hands just like this.